Now, our next speaker, which I'll invite out to get set up, is Morag Gamble. Now, Morag actually isn't just going to talk to us about permaculture, but the way Morag actually engages with this topic is that it is her life. It's actually a whole philosophy. It's not just about planting companion crops and making sure things are growing well. It's actually about how do we actually live in a much more, I guess, systemed way with the people we live with, as well as what we're growing and eating and how we live and making sustainable options. So Morag is going to be sharing a lot of that about how a truly sustainable way of life looks. That sounds pretty flash, Morag. Morag, what's your favourite vegetable?
The whole of the pumpkin plant, every single part of it.
Who's ever eaten the whole of a pumpkin plant? Your dog? Morag will speak to you later about how you can. And Morag, what sort of thing do you love growing most? Is there a particular plant that you just love to watch as it kind of flourishes and blossoms?
Well, the pumpkin, I think.
The pumpkin again.
Do you know, it's a self-seeding plant. It just keeps coming in your garden. It gives and it gives and it gives. It's its ground cover. You can eat the seeds, you can eat the outside, you can eat the flowers, you can eat the leaves, and it provides shade for the chickens, and it provides mulch for the garden and materials for the compost. It's kind of like your whole system's buddy.
It's the super plant, isn't it, really?
Well, and it's edible. And the thing to remember about it too is that we often think in an what's that word? A people-centered way about a pumpkin, thinking, oh, it's for us. But actually, what is the purpose of a pumpkin? And if you can get in the mind of a pumpkin, then you can start to look at your whole garden differently. So if you think about a pumpkin, right?
I just actually wish you were doing a whole thing called In the Mind of a Pumpkin. That would be something, I reckon. Sorry, keep going, Morag.
Well, I was just going to say, we often look at a pumpkin and think about that pumpkin being something that's for us, that beautiful orange flesh. But actually, what is a pumpkin for? The pumpkin flesh, what is it for? What do you think?
I'd just like to think it's for me to indulge in.
Well, actually, the pumpkin itself the pumpkin flesh is for nourishing the seeds. And so this whole idea about thinking about whole systems and whole foods, if you're trying to plant beautiful pumpkins, you take a piece of the flesh and a piece of the plant and you plant it with the seeds, and then you get this beautiful
Amazing
pumpkin patch.
There
But anyway,
go.
I'm not going to talk about vegetables.
No, she's not talking
today.
about pumpkins, but she's going to talk to us about how a truly sustainable life looks. Would you please welcome Morag Gamble?
Thank you. Well, that's a really interesting place to start. Let's just go back a little bit to the beginning. So my question was, what does a truly sustainable society look like? And I just want to begin by saying, I don't think I'm going to tell you the exact answer to this question, but it is a question that I've carried with me for my entire life. I remember as a young teenager looking at what was going on in the world around me. Brian was talking about what was going on in the 1970s and saying, there was all this movement happening, and a lot of that was a response to the crises that we were facing at the time. But back as a young teenager then, I didn't see the solutions. All I could see was the crises. And it took me a very long time being a big activist in the peace movement, the environment movement, and all different realms to start to think, well, I don't want to fight my entire life. I don't want to be this person who's always being against things. What am I for? And I had the great honour the other day of meeting up with some of the young students who are part of the student strike movement. Has anyone met any of those people so far? Does anyone know the student strike movement that's happening? Yeah, it's phenomenal. There's 20 to 30,000 students every Friday taking to the streets in cities everywhere saying, we can't vote, but we really care about the future of this planet, and we care about our future as a community. What are we going to do about it? We need to stand up and listen. They're asking us as adults in various forms of community everywhere to stand with them. And I felt this enormous sense of power in those students that they're going at the moment, what's happening just cannot happen. And we're not going to go back to school on a Friday until change happens. And so this powerful movement for change is emerging. And so like we're hearing, there's these ripples and changes that happen over time. And we're in a moment where there is this powerful quest for change. And we need to start to think about, well, if it's not that, what does it look like? And it was so great to see the slides from Ben about, well, that's an example. And that is a really holistic example about one way that we can create a way forward. And I work with people all around the world. I think I've worked now in 22 different countries, 5 continents, working with local communities, and they're asking this question. What does it look like if we don't want that? If this is causing us pain, it's damaging our environment, it's undermining our communities, it's undermining our personal well-being, what are we actually trying to do? And I'm so glad that you're all here today, because I know that you're on this path questioning this as well. So from community gardens to eco-villages to local centres, people are asking this question. And I think what that gives to me, not only the students, but people of all ages, it gives me a great sense of hope that there's these people everywhere I go, in every community, there are people who are working towards change, and it gives me an enormous sense of hope that we are going to make a change. But I did want to say that, this is, like others have said too, it's not a new movement, it's not just a new awakening, although maybe a new realisation. We've sort of come out of, I think, maybe a decade of sort of not thinking too much about it. But it's an ancient paradigm, this way of, the permaculture ethics. The underlying ethics are fantastic. Caring for the earth, caring for people, and fair share of our resources. And so I think if we look to cultures Indigenous cultures from all different places, we can find a lot of answers. And it was actually in this is me up on the corner there, eating a piece of homemade bread with my Ladakhi mother. This was taken about 1992, I think. And that piece of bread changed my life. I went through landscape architecture school, and I studied that book, Design with Nature, that Brian was talking about, and I had it all in my head about what a sustainable society should look like. On paper, I could design it, I could draw it, I could do the landscape architecture drawings and sketch up villages and all sorts of things. But I'd never actually experienced what that meant. And I could also go and earn some money to be able to buy my bread, buy my food. But it wasn't actually till I held this piece of bread in my hand and everything that it embodied, it blew my whole notion about what it actually meant to live a real and sustainable and healthy and high quality, connected to nature, connected to community way of life. And what that did to me, I'd always been in my head up until that point. I knew about stuff. I could tell you what a good solar system was. I could tell you what a good wastewater system was. But it wasn't until then that I felt it. And it was at that point that I started to really focus on talking heart to heart rather than head to head, and really connecting through all the education programs I do, like this complete head, heart, hands approach. Because I don't think until we really feel it, like passionately feel the angst, the anger, the shame, the guilt, the urgency, whatever it might be, that we get up and make a change about what we need to really do in this world. So anyway, just going back to my little story about the bread. So this piece of bread there, it was a phenomenal experience because, firstly, you normally go to the bread. It might be a really nice baker or whatever, but the bread is still something that you consume. This piece of bread, these communities were totally interconnected. So, for example, they're on the Indus River, which is a massive river on the other side of the Himalayas. And right up high near the glacier, they start to divert water off the Indus to get to a point, and then they drop it down to this stone mill, and it goes round very, very slowly. So it's this water-powered mill, and it's a community mill. Everyone uses that mill. To grow the grain, they have a series of terraces that they've collected human manure over centuries to build up this soil. And they don't have each person their own farm and animals and everything. They share. And this is a really important question about this whole concept of sharing. If you didn't have any money, and if you didn't have much land or much resources, how would you live? You'd most likely share the stuff that you had. And it's an interesting thing. I'm just going to sort of divert at this point because there's a really big question that we have underlying we're kind of at the limits of the Earth's ecological systems. I mean, you've all heard about the ecological footprint, right? So if everyone in the world was to live like a typical Australian, how many Earths would we need to support our needs and to absorb our wastes? Has anyone got any ideas? 7. Yeah, well, actually, thankfully, not quite yet. It's 5. 5 is kind of the figure that's out there at the moment. But the thing that's frightening as well is that when you count up everyone's ecological footprint, just as it is now, we actually need 1.7 Earths. We only have 1. So what is one planet living look like? The other side of this conversation that I wanted to put in here was that there's something called the Earth Overshoot Day. Has anyone heard of that? It's attached with the ecological footprint. So if you look at, okay, so we have a budget in the year of the ecological limits. So how much nature is able to meet our needs as a society and absorb our wastes. So at what point in the year do you think we run out of this budget and we start eating into future generations and future years and other species' needs? Do you have any idea what date that might be? Well, that's kind of a good point. Well, yes, if you add them all up. Sorry, I can't see any of you. When I'm talking to you, it's really nice to see you. So does anyone have any idea when that overshoot, they call it Overshoot Day, and every year they calculate it. Today. I didn't hear that, sorry? Today. Well, it's pretty close, you know. If you look at the global Overshoot Day, it's now August the 1st. So everything that we do globally after August the 1st is eating into the future generations. In Australia, there's a couple of dates I found, somewhere between March the 12th and March the 31st. So you're pretty close to today. It's really only a couple of weeks away that we have, as a country, run out of our kind of budget. And so what do we do about that? Say if in 30 days you had to stop using stuff, what would you do? How would you live? How would you survive? How would you make ends meet? How would you provide yourself with food? And so these are the sorts of questions. How could you live with in a one planet way of life? So that means reducing your energy consumption by 80%, reducing your wastes by that, all of these things. And so these Ecovillage models that we're talking about that are being measured and tracked are actually starting to show these sorts of figures. So it is a really interesting model to be looking at, to actually work towards one Earth living. And I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that eco-villages are the one and only answer, what Brian was talking about, but all those different models are. But it's not just the model or the system or the technology. It's what's going on in our attitude and our perceptions and in our hearts, and how then we use our hands to make a difference. And so this, coming back to my little story about the bread, this taught me about one Earth living, because everything in this place in Ladakh, on the other side of the Himalayas, arose from the earth and went back to the earth. Their clothing came from yak wool, their shoes came from yak wool, their houses emerged out of the mud around them. Beautiful mud brick homes with solar passive walls that were designed in a way to have internal composting toilets. You know, these are hundreds of years old, these systems. These guys were doing it way, way before any of us were thinking about it, and spending time living in villages like this, traditional sustainable villages, made me ask that question really substantially. What does a truly sustainable society look like here in Australia? What does that mean? How can we learn from this? And so many of the things that they were doing were living in a money-free society. So whatever they could do without money, they did. If they could share something, they would share it. If they would grow together, they would grow together. If they could share animals instead of all having their own individual... You know, like these animals, the zoos, are a little bit like, you know, it's similar of like, well, we all have our mowers. Well, you know, you don't need them all. You know, they don't all have their own zoos because they realised that they couldn't sustain them because they were aware of their ecological limits. And so looking to cultures like this is a really, really important thing. So this bread, you actually plant by hand, you harvest by hand, you collect and you use animals and you sing songs of thanks to the animals as you separate the grain. And then the chaff, there's a song that goes with everything. When you're singing to the zoes of a thank you song for helping you. And then there's a particular song that goes with threshing the grain as well. And that's definitely a whistle song, because if you actually open your mouth while you're threshing, you get a mouthful of chaff. So it's imbued with culture, with intergenerational activities. There's so much to learn from that. And so I think we also need to sit and talk with our local Indigenous elders and Indigenous elders wherever we can find them in any country, and to say, well, what does a sustainable society look like, and what does it mean to you, and how are we to move forward, and to base our thinking upon that, rather than just going ahead thinking, okay, well, I've got a really good system and a really good idea, like permaculture, for example, and head on in that way. Whoops, sorry. So one of the things that I do, I actually live at Crystal Waters, and I've been living there for the last 20 years. But I do teach permaculture in many different communities. But rather than going and, like I said, teaching it, I actually work with local communities to help facilitate their I guess, re-embracing of traditional ways of being too. And we're so far disconnected, I think, in our own cultures here, that we've forgotten those. And it's really about thinking how we can move, not backwards, but forwards with that knowledge and that understanding. So currently I've been doing a lot of work with people in Uganda and Kenya. And this particular women's group on the end here, I met with them just recently, and they were basically, a lot of the undermining culture of sustainable living in their villages has been undermined because of big corporate, forces in the world. And I don't want to really go into that, except to say that often our way of life and our needs, our overconsumption, impacts people like this. I was talking to some of them who are tea farmers, for example, and we all enjoy a cup of tea. Guess how much a tea farmer gets for growing the tea? Beautiful, could be organic tea. They really don't earn anything. What they earn gets taken away in fees from the company that controls the whole tea system. They I don't know why they do it, actually. It didn't make any sense to me. And what they do get, I think it was about, it was like $1 for a 10-kilogram bag, but then they had to pay a lot of fees. And you think about how much we spend for a very small packet, and then wrapped in, plasticised tea bags. There's so many different things that we do that we don't think about in our daily lives, that when you go and live with these communities here, you start thinking, oh my gosh, we actually taking responsibility right now, today and this week, for what we do in everything, every decision that we make and everything that we do is actually a priority. And if we did all take responsibility today, whether we lived in an eco-village, a tiny house or whatever, we would be able to massively reduce our impact and start to form really strong connections, because what this is about forming community, forming very strong connection with the land in which we live, our neighbourhoods in which we dwell, the community that we're part of, and this is the foundation for so much of what we're talking about. So the work that I do takes me into refugee camps and working with children. I'm realising I'm telling too many stories along the way, and I wanted to share some of the stories about other eco-villages that I think are really interesting in terms of these are places that are not necessarily new projects, but I've always seen them as beacons on the landscape of examples of really well-functioning communities. So on this end, just in the middle here, the shared garden, this is actually from a place called Village Homes in California. It's interesting because it's a whole subdivision that's developed in the middle of all this other normal suburbia, but it's completely different because it's public space in between is all edible landscape. And where the roads are normal in a normal development, it's walkways and bikeways. All the cars are kept on the outside. So it actually makes us think differently about our public space, our common space. There's a massive movement that's happening in the world at the moment called recommoning. And it's really thinking about what's happening in those spaces in between, not just in our own places, but in those in-between places. And how can we as communities interact with those and change what's happening there? So within Village Homes, for example, it's possible to walk and ride everywhere, and along those walkways is where you see all the food growing production areas, like the community gardens, and the street trees are almonds, for example, and so they harvest 7 tonnes of almonds every year, and they use those in the community, sell them to help support other projects. They have their own little vineyard. In another community in Horsøy, which is in Denmark, they have things like shared. It's a sort of a co-housing eco-village project not far from a city called Aarhus, which is a bit north of Copenhagen. And anyway, this place here, it's an absolutely fascinating place because one of the things, it's a suburb, and the reason I'm bringing these examples is because we actually live in a world in and around southeast Queensland which has this amazing spread of suburbs happening at the moment, and we need to be thinking differently about it. It's the only option that we're kind of really seeing, or when people go in to buy a home, that's what they see. This suburban development actually has the farm at its core. So they identified, using the overlay method, what is the best agricultural land, and then they push the houses out to the side of that. So all the waste nutrients, all the waste water goes down to the farm. They employ farmers to produce the food with the community if they want that, and then that goes back into the community. And then they also have little shared clusters of chickens. So people say, I can't do this or can't do that because I have a really busy life. Well, this means once a fortnight you're on chicken duty and you look after the chooks, you get all the eggs for a couple of weeks, and it's simple. And you can do this in that example that Brian was talking about as well, but pulling down the fences. And David Holmgren's also talking about this a lot in his new book, Retro Suburbia, about what can we do where we are right now to pull down the barriers in between us and to start create eco-villages where we are, eco-neighbourhoods, and simple things like this, sharing a flock of chickens. Where I live at Crystal Waters, we have a little dairy herd that we share. So once every couple of weeks, it's my turn to go down with my kids and milk the cows. Because my boys drink a lot of milk, and I was saying to them, look, if you're going to drink that much milk, we'll have to start milking cows. And thankfully, at that time, we had the shared milking system set up. So we go down, we bring our bucket home, and we make all our own cheeses and yogurts. But I'm not stuck to doing the milking all the time. So this idea of being a self-sufficient community or a self-sufficient person, a homesteader, it's not a dreary thing that takes enormous amount of effort all the time. There's shared things that you can do that enable you to live this way of life without having to have this kind of weight on your shoulder. And you can go away for a month or two and then come back and take on an extra roster or two. But what I do want to remind us too is that at the core of this, we do live in a commons, and that's the natural commons, the earth, the air, the water, everything. It's a commons. And a part of the core foundation of permaculture is earth care, and that really the foundation of everything that we do is acknowledgement of that. And another type of commons that I wanted to mention too is this whole idea of sharing farms and sharing food production areas. This is, someone mentioned in the last question about land trusts. Land trusts in places like the United States are incredibly popular and have been for a long time. This is a farmland trust on a remnant piece of land in a suburban area, and the community bought up this land so it wasn't covered over by suburban development. And on it is the Centre for Urban Agriculture, and it's a place that provides, it's a CSA model, it has education, it has training, it has community kitchens, it has all those elements that we want in a community, in an eco-village, but just on a piece of remnant farmland that's been transformed into this. And these sorts of things make it possible. And the more that we connect with each other to vision and think about what sort of change we want, we can really make a lot of difference in our food system. So shared food, shared land, shared housing, shared energy systems, shared toilet systems, we've heard of that. This is another picture of the Horsøy project in Denmark. And whenever I go to another eco-village or community or eco-house, I always check out their toilet system. It's kind of one of those fascinations because, we think in permaculture, we think about what's going in our mouths, or as, people who are focused on health. But also what comes out the other end is extremely important, and understanding what kind of systems are available. I think as soon as I came across those in Ladakh, 25, 30 years ago, I was absolutely fascinated. So their system is really interesting. It's a suburb, and they have a dry composting toilet. They collect the human manure, which gets used in all the orchard systems buried underground, but they collectively bring together all the urine. So every house has these urine separating toilets, and it gets diverted out into the landscape where they have, it's a lined pit, and growing in that, it's very fast growing trees, and then they coppice that and use that in a very efficient chippy heater, which provides the whole village with its central heating for winter. Don't forget, this is Denmark. It gets freezing up there. So, you go there and they're plying you with drinks just to make sure you go to the toilet so their trees grow so they get lots of heat for winter. So there's this interconnected system, also energy system, and this is another picture of the village homes down the bottom here, which is just showing you how that there's no fences. It's not like the standard suburban development. You can wander through, and all the kids who grow up there absolutely love it because they know when the peaches are on and when the nectarines and the pomegranates, and it's an open community. It's a flipped community, and I think a lot of what we have to do is flip our thinking about development and move away from this what's mine to being part of something much larger, because what we need to be thinking about is something much larger again than that. And I think stepping out of that model and into thinking about how we together can start to make a difference and start to design things differently. So one of my main projects, often when I'm going to places, is helping to facilitate through permaculture design a process I call citizen design. And it's basically people who belong to an area. They're citizens, right? It's reclaiming our citizenship and not thinking, well, they have to fix this park for us, or they have to mow it, or they'll do this. It's us. Public land is our land. And that's a really important thing to remember. And what do we want to see happen in our local parks, in our local areas? And how can we design? And so I think it's very disabling when we don't have design skills, when we don't understand how to observe, when we don't understand how to negotiate communicating with the different stakeholders in areas. So what I do is trying to help people connect and understand the design process and how they can not only design it, facilitate it, but fix it when it breaks as well, which is a really important thing, particularly when you're working in places like Africa. No point helping people to create systems that as soon as you're gone, they fall over. No one's there to fix them. So it's about appropriate small-scale technologies and systems everywhere. And I think the really important thing to remember is that a lot of the solutions are tiny. Like the tiny house. It's tiny little interventions and tiny little shifts in the way that we think and the way that we act that makes the enormous difference. So this is Northey Street City Farm. It was one of the projects I helped to start back in the early 90s. Has anyone been to Northey Street City Farm, by the way, down in Brisbane? Yeah. I remember I went away for a few years down to, up actually, into Ladakh, and I came back and I literally cried because I could see this enormous a shift in how people were thinking about this land and a sense of ownership. All of a sudden, this blank piece of land that was compacted and dead had turned into a food forest and a place where wildlife and people of all different cultures and social communities were coming together and dreaming other things. So dreaming a market, it now generates over $1 million and has 9 different enterprises and employs a huge amount of people, and it educates thousands of people every Sunday. Actually, they have 1,000 or more people coming to the market, so it touches people. So this is kind of one of the key things that I wanted to mention next. It's about we need to start to change the story that we tell into one of the possibilities. And I was a little bit happy the other day because I got to take the stage at Sustainable Living Festival with one of my heroes, David Holmgren, who's the founder of Permaculture. And I'm also extremely happy because I met this woman beside me. Her name is Davita Davidson. And she's just was phenomenal in explaining what is happening in places like Detroit in America. I don't know if you heard, but a lot of cities are in decay in the States. Detroit used to have 2.5 million people, and now it has, I think, 600,000 to 700,000. Through these sorts of strategies, community food systems, thinking about how we can reconnect, they've actually transformed through urban agriculture, urban community development, urban community neighbourhood development, like the retro-suburbia concept, to transform the whole entire ring around Detroit. And so we can be in this process of creating change in terms of building new developments, or re-inhabiting ones that exist and just tweaking a bit, or we can go into the most disastrous places and turn them around. And I think it's a little bit like when we talk about encouraging people who are doing permaculture, not to go into a nice forested area and chop down trees to create a village, or even to somewhere that's nice. Take the worst piece of land that you can find and see if you can turn it around. And I think that's also a challenge, that where there is so much decay, urban decay, rural town decay, how can we turn those places around and bring life back into them through this concept of retelling our story, thinking differently about where we are? Because often I talk to people, I say, yeah, I'll get into permaculture and Ecovillage thinking when I retire, or when I get more money, or when my kids leave home, or when this or when that. What about now? What about now? You know, it's such a huge thing that we can do simply by lifting those barriers that we place on ourselves. So I wanted to just let you know that from a permaculture perspective, if you're looking for more information, my blog and newsletter and YouTube channel, actually, Our Permaculture Life. If you wanted to see, I have lots of interviews of people all around the world, and lots of information about how to do all this kind of stuff. And I also have a permaculture charity I use. I redirect money from all the work that I do into this charity to help support the projects like the micro-enterprise programs in Africa. Those women that you saw, I've currently got a program, and for the last week I've been putting out information to help them to create their own eco-village project in far western Kenya, where they've pretty much got nothing. And I managed to raise $1,000 in 7 days, so I'm pretty chuffed about that. But we had 1,500, so if you can go on there and help me out, that would be great. They keep WhatsApping me and say, how's it going? I'm like, can you just wait a few more weeks? I'll get something together for you. And the other thing I want to let you know is that I really do believe that permaculture design and thinking is quite often it's this amazing foundation of the thinking and the design skills that we all need in order to make these type of things happen and to keep them going. And so if you want to find out more about those sorts of things, that's the top line there, the Permaculture Education Institute. My goal is to really help create thousands and thousands of permaculture teachers around the world who are capable and have excellent skills to bring this vision forward. At the moment, I have hubs in Africa and hubs in Asia, hubs in Australia, New Zealand, America, England, and it's a movement that's happening. So please join me, and if you have any questions, I think there's a mic down the front, and I'm going to be here all day, and I do invite you to come up and have a chat. I would love to have a chat with you. So thanks for listening.
That's awesome, Morag. So if you've got a question that you'd love to ask Morag now that would be beneficial for us all, if you just come down and just stand behind that microphone right there in the middle of the room, you can share your question and Morag will tell you a good story in response. And I did notice a particular picture down on the bottom row in the middle. I noticed that. I did, I can see that. If not sure, that's pumpkins. Any questions for Morag? You got one? Can you, if you can't make it to there, you can just yell out really loudly, if that's helpful.
It's not really about the permaculture per se. I have a question about my not living forever and ever and needing to be buried at some point. And it occurred to me, I've seen that it's possible to have an outfit covered in seeds and you are buried in the ground and become a tree. That to me would be perfect. I don't want this explanation. So is there something, because we're talking about living and children and everything, but there is a point when we're not here anymore. So is that also something integral to how you...
I think we need to be looking at all stages of our life and honouring all stages of our life. Interestingly, at Crystal Waters, we do have a cemetery, and it's there's a place where it's actually not far from my house, just opposite. And I often go down there with my kids, and we know all the people's names who live there. who are buried there. They don't live there, they're somewhere else, aren't they? But, you know, there's a tree, there's a silky oak, particular silky oak that was planted where one man was buried, Stuart. And every time we go past, you know, we touch the silky oak and say good day to Stuart and remember him. And I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to raise your children and to keep present in your community the members who are there, not sort of stick them somewhere outside and never go and visit them. I think it's a really important part, and I would love to see more of that happening. I know at the Sustainability Centre in UK, I'm about to head over there very soon, they have actually a whole eco-burial service that they do, and it's all connected to their woodlands and their, you know, beautiful boxes. And I haven't heard of the seed dress one, but I think that's a beautiful one. You know, organic wraps imbued with seeds of native species from around your area. There you go, there's a whole enterprise that you could start to create. And this is the thing, we need sustainable enterprises to make this work, because people go, well, I can't afford it, or my work is here and this is how I think. We need to start linking up how we think, how we live, how we work, how we die, everything. It's about that interconnecting, the systems thinking approach to life and embracing everything.
Thanks, Morag. That's a good response, thank you. Any other thoughts or questions, particularly for Morag, that she can just respond to? That's all right. And you know what? The same deal, because remember these next 2 days, it's actually not just about getting a whole bunch of good ideas and hearing lots of information. It's actually also the chance to try to connect, as Morag was just suggesting there, trying to connect some of those things and actually allow them to bring some change of life or a new way of kind of moving forward together. And so please, make sure you come up and have a yarn with Morag. Talk to her about the pumpkin. Like, if you're not sure where to start, talk about pumpkins, because we know Morag will go and love to have a conversation about pumpkins.
And if you see one of these around, this is my contact details and YouTube channel on the back too. So that's me.
Yeah.
Card.
Hey, could you join me and just say a massive thank you to Morag for sharing her story?